Okay, hello YouTube. Today we're going to be covering what to do in the Sicilian after e4, c5, knight f3, d6, d4, c d4, knight d4, knight f6, knight c3. We're going to have a Najdorf with a6. We're going to play bishop c4, and we're going to be covering what to do if somebody plays this early move, pawn to e5. So anyways, if you like content like this and want to see more of it, please hit that subscribe button and click on that notification icon. So I don't just want to cover what to do when somebody plays e5 in this scenario. I also want to cover why we can play the move that we can play here, but we can't play it in other situations where black plays the move pawn to e5. I think that's a really critical thing to understand. Because in this position where black plays e5, it's perfectly acceptable to play the move knight f5, and after knight f5, white should have some sort of advantage here. This position should be somewhere between major to decisive advantage white. But the question is, why can we play knight f5 here, but we can't play knight f5 in other scenarios in the open Sicilian? For example, in the move order with bishop to e2, when they play e5, we know that knight f5 is not a main line here. The main lines are, generally speaking, the main line is knight to b3. So why is it that we can't play knight to f5 here? So the reason you can't play knight to f5 here is because the move d5 in this position is very strong. So basically, whenever you have a situation where this knight is going to be hanging on the f5 square because the bishop is attacking it, because we're attacking the base of this pawn chain, then knight f5 becomes a problem. As you can see here, we can't really play, knight takes d5, knight takes d5, queen d5, queen d5, e d5. Eventually, the pawn will no longer be defending the knight on f5, and that knight on f5 will hang. So that's why this situation where we've played bishop instead of to e2, say bishop to c4, is a little bit different. Here when we play bishop c4 and they play pawn to e5, knight to f5, if they were to play d5 here, the f5 square will be continually protected. We can simply play knight takes d5. If bishop takes f5, ef5, everything is fine. The d5 square is double protected. If they continue to capture on d5, we can continue to capture with pieces that are not this pawn on the e4 square. So that leads to, what about other scenarios where it seems like knight f5 might be okay? Well, in all those scenarios, it's pretty much the same thing. It's as long as you can play d5 and that knight gets undermined, then knight f5 isn't so hot. So another example would be this main line with e5 right away. Knight f5 again is no good because we have d5. Now here it's not terrible, like white isn't going to be worse, but the position should just be completely equal after something like queen d5, e d5, bishop f5 takes. This position is completely equal. So anyways, so rewinding back to the position that's relevant here, where we have d6 and we go into this Najdorf, we play bishop c4 and they play pawn to e5. Here we play knight f5. Now this position should be a slight edge to major advantage. Oh, the question is, why? What's going on? Well, let's say they kick the knight. They just don't do anything. They just attack it. We can just move the knight back to e3, and now, of course, we're dominating the d5 square. Generally speaking, this should be considered good. So an example of a computer line would be something like bishop e6, knight on e to d5. We'll say knight on b to d7, bishop g5, h6. We exchange off. We play something like queen e2, b5. We could exchange off again, bring that bishop to d5. This should just be major advantage white all day long. White's dominated that d5 square. White is doing pretty good. So what if they're not so nice? What if they decide to at least take the knight and double our pawns, which is, I think, what most people are going to do. They're going to take and double our pawns. Well, here, white should have an advantage because white has better control of the light squares. White has the two bishops. And more importantly, white has a firm grip on that d5 square. So an example would be something like bishop e7. We could just plop that knight down on d5. We could also play g4. And we could also play bishop e3. And actually at this point, it's not 100% clear what is the best move here for white. It's clear that white has an advantage, but it's not 100% clear what the best move is for white. White actually has multiple good moves, because white's position is better positionally. You're better because you're dominating that d5 square. So you have a couple different ways you can go about continuing to dominate that d5 square. So bishop e3 is reasonable. After knight on b to d7, you could play queen f3. You can dominate that d5 square with pieces. So queen c7, bishop b3, knight c5, bishop d5, castles, queenside, rook a c8, bishop c5, queen c5 would be an example. white still has domination over the d5 square, white still has domination over the light squares, white still has a far superior bishop to black's bishop. Obviously, white should be doing pretty good here. But we can approach this other ways. We can approach this by plopping that knight down on d5 immediately. We can play knight d5, castles, bishop e3, knight d5, bishop d5, and we can play the position like this, knight c6, queen d2, something like this. This position should also be advantage white. We can also be very, very direct. We could do something like g4, h6, bishop e3, knight on b to d7, queen e2, rook c8, bishop b3, knight c5. We could just take, play rook d1, play knight d5, bishop d5, and this position should be some sort of advantage white. For example, bishop h4, queen e4, we should have an advantage here. So there's multiple ways of going about doing this to declare that you have some sort of advantage with the white pieces. But in short, white should have some sort of advantage here with the white pieces, no matter what. And it should be somewhere between a major advantage to decisive advantage. But just a good rule of thumb is you can put the knight on f5 anytime they cannot meet knight f5 with d5. So another example would be as if you play one of these other big-time main lines like bishop g5. Here, e5 again shouldn't be sound, because if knight f5, they're not going to be able to play pawn to d5, because here you have bishop f6, queen f6, knight d5, should just be decisively winning for white. So, again, in this situation, knight f5 should be fine. So, again, if bishop f5, ef5, this should be some sort of advantage white for the same reasons as previously discussed. You have domination over the light squares, you have strong bishop pair, you have two bishops, you have a bishop on g5, bishop f1, that's still two bishops, you still have a strong domination of the light squares, and a strong domination over the central square and the central outpost, d5. So, you do have another option if you don't want to go into all of this, like if you play bishop c4 and they play e5, if you don't want to play knight f5, of course it is always possible to retreat your knight. I actually had one game that I played where this turned out really well. I played knight on d to e2, my opponent played bishop e7. I played bishop g5, and my opponent got excited and took, which immediately lost to knight takes, and then knight f7. And of course I went on to win very easily without much of a fight. But that's kind of a lucky story in a lot of ways, because the truth is when you retreat your knight, when you play either knight e2 or knight f3, it shouldn't really matter which one, all you have right now is a very, very slight edge. But if you play knight f5, and you're threatening to bring that knight back to e3, in this situation where they cannot play d5 because you have your bishop on c4 already, you're going to have a major to decisive advantage, because you're going to be able to occupy that d5 square with all of your pieces that can occupy the d5 square after either g5, g6 followed by knight e3, or after bishop takes f5, ef5, where you have this full domination over d5. So that's basically why you need to play knight to f5 against e5 in certain lines of the Najdorf, and of course when you can't play knight f5 against certain lines. Like if you'd played bishop e2 or bishop e3, knight f5 is no longer any good, because they're going to meet it with that early d5 where that knight is not being held. Anyways, I hope you found this video helpful. I hope you learned something new about chess, and I hope you can use some of these ideas in your own games. Thank you very much for watching.